Okay, very warm welcome from my side. Welcome to this room and to this panel discussion we're having today. My name is Sophia. I'm an Austrian trade unionist from Gewerkschaft GPA, but I'm also a member of the European Economic and Social Committee, and I've got the pleasure of moderating today's panel, sponsored by the ESC. The European Economic and Social Committee is advisory institution within the European Union. So our job is to represent employers as well as trade unions, as civil society organizations in the legislative process. So we give opinions to all of the pieces that the Commission comes forth with, and to give our input, to give a voice to the institutions in the whole process, and to make them heard, so to have the social partners as well as civil society organizations included in the process of lawmaking. Today's panel is under the title of Resilient, Sustainable and Responsible Supply Chain for Critical Raw Materials. It's quite topical. Today we have heard quite a lot about critical raw materials already in the plenary discussions, and I believe in some of the side room discussions as well. It is a question we have to face when we're looking into the future of European industries, but also when we want to analyze the global situation right now and dependencies we're facing there. So I'm really happy to have a lot of experts and expertise on this panel, and I want to introduce the panelists to you at the very beginning. So to my left is Isabelle Barthès. She is the Deputy General Secretary of Industrial Europe. Industrial Europe is a European trade union federation representing industry manufacturing sectors such as the metal industries, chemical, textile, clothing and footwear. Representing about 7 million working men and women within 180 trade union affiliates in 38 European countries. So you represent more than the European Union. Happy to have you here. Well, very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Next to her is Diego Francesco Marin. He works for the European Environmental Bureau, the EEB. It is... So, the EEB is Europe's largest network of environmental citizens organizations. You as well represent 180 member organizations, so something you've got in common. And your goals are the sustainable development, environmental justice, and participatory democracy, so I think you bring in quite a broad spectrum of expertise to this topic. Thank you for being here. Then we've got Michael Pinter. He is a member of the CCMI within the European Economic and Social Committee. The CCMI is the Consultative Commission on Industrial Change, so quite an important institution within the ESC. And he's a delegate from Slovakia, from the US Steel in Košice, and he's been recently working on digital industrial change and its sectoral and societal impact, and actually was mainly in charge, together with another colleague, for our opinion on the Critical Raw Materials Act. So thanks for sharing your expertise with us today as well. And last but not least, to your very right, is Sandra Parti. She is the president of the section on internal market and the single market in the European Economic and Social Committee. She was before an expert and still is on industrial policies, on the green transitions, and has been putting a lot of expertise also from her day job in the IW, it's in English it's the German Economic Institute, into the whole process. So in her private job, she's working a lot on private economic research, advocating for liberal economic and social order. And I think this is quite a good mix-up to discuss in the industrial policy and Green Deal aspects as well. So thanks a lot. We will go into detail on your opinions, on your expertise very shortly. but I would like to start with a presentation or a summary. What are we actually dealing with? It doesn't really come as a surprise, and we've heard it quite often that nowadays we have quite a peculiar situation, and that for the very first time we see a lot of aspects in our global world changing and having a huge impact on our daily lives, on our industries, and on our working conditions on a scale that has never been here before. We believe, and this is something that we also cover in one of the opinions by the European Economic and Social Committee, that the global value chains, on the one hand, climate change that we're facing, but also decent work, they are interconnected, but sometimes we lack the view on all of these aspects to be together. And this is something that we tried via this opinion, this panel today, that we tried to connect these dots and to go forward by implementing policies and ideas that actually include and have an exclusive view on these matters. I think we're all clear here in the room that on the medium and long-term objective, we need to diversify our supply chains, especially when it comes to critical raw materials. But we have to consider different aspects here, and we will explore them today in the panel. For instance, we really need to reduce our consumption and the demand within the European Union. I think this is one of the major goals that we have to tackle somehow, which will be painful and difficult, and we will have some ideas about that today as well. We will have to invest in mining, and in mining in a way that is that also promotes decent work on the one hand, that it reduces accidents and work-related incidents, but also looks at the whole environment, that we have a socially responsible but also an environmental responsible way of mining. We also need to speak about using renewable raw materials. We need to speak about recycling and about the circular economy, and we've got some experts on that one on the panel as well. And we have to raise issues of democracy and reliable partners. The past 2 years have shown us that diversifying the supply chain is also deeply connected to the question of democracy, of participatory democracy, of civil society organizations, and the freedom of employers, organizations, as well as trade unions in different countries. And if we want to have reliable and sustainable economic links with other countries, we have to consider this as well. So I think there are a lot of matters on the table, and I really hope that you are on board discussing with us the link not only in the critical raw materials from a purely perspective of industrial and economic interests, but also to have a look at trade interests, at social and labor rights, and at ecological interests. The basic idea today is that we will start off with a few statements from our panel, but we will have Slido available as well. So as far as I'm informed, the technicians will show you from time to time the slide for Slido, so you can give us some comments or questions via your mobile phones, your tablets or notebooks via Slido. And we really hope that we have some time afterwards as well to take personal comments from the floor, from the participants. So somebody will come up with a microphone in case you have questions in the second half of our panel debate today. Then let's dig into it. Let's start off with the critical raw materials, as the Critical Raw Materials Act at the very beginning. And Michael, I would like to ask you to give us an overview. What are we actually speaking about, and what are, according to the CCMI, to the ESC, some recommendations we give towards the European Commission, what should change in the CMRA?
Thank you, Sophia, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me. I will try to speak as loud as I can because it's very noisy. As we heard already in the opening session earlier today, and as we also heard from Sylvia, critical raw materials are the new oil, the new geopolitical weapon. As much as we might not want to consider it, this may well be the new reality, as green technologies in general are more mineral intensive than the conventional ones. whether you take lithium, graphite, cobalt, rare earths, these are indispensable for production of electrical cars, batteries, smartphones, solar panels, turbines, solar technologies. So they are all fundamental to our green and digital future. What is the picture in the EU, speaking of this? Couple of numbers. The EU is only producing less than 5% of world's production of mineral raw materials. China is the main supplier of 21 critical raw materials out of 34 listed by the Commission to the EU. For majority of metals, the EU depends on imports between 75 to 100%. This is all the more critical considering that some of our raw material suppliers have already taken various measures to curtail their own exports. Those who are witnessing the situation know that as of 1st of August, China introduced export restrictions on gallium and germanium, which are critical for production of electronics and semiconductors. Considering that China produces 60% of world germanium and 80% of world gallium and is the main EU supplier on both metals, I think this is really a warning and a taste of what probably has to come. The reality is cruel. The EU is heavily dependent on foreign countries. As regards critical materials, you know, when the war started, how much we built our dependency on Russian natural gas. You all know how much oil was misused in the 70s, and our future relies on something which is not available in the EU. As Sofia already mentioned, we developed an opinion on Critical Raw Materials Act, which came from the Commission, and we asked the Commission to flexibly consider its EU import dependencies for various raw materials and vulnerabilities along supply chains. We very much welcome the Commission proposal, but on the other side, we also said that there are some inadequate measures, and we called on the Commission to consider some improvements. I will only be able to cover a few of them, but first of all, let me start with regulatory certainty for investments and burden to businesses. For the success of any, not only the CRM policy, stability and attractiveness of the EU business environment is of course decisive. Currently, as we know, and this is even more visible after the introduction of IRA in the United States, there is a multitude of overlapping legislative frameworks and frequent legislative revisions, as well as competing and multiplied reporting and auditing requirements. Therefore, we think at the ESC and CCMI that overregulation must be avoided, and any new revised EU legislation should be subject to strict competitiveness check. Secondly, implementation. Following the publication of the CRM Act, multiple sectoral associations we've been talking to have highlighted the need to provide precise guidance to stakeholders as to how the list of strategic and critical raw materials will be implemented and reflected in specific EU policies. For example, we believe that clarification is required on prioritization of projects where the main extracted material is neither strategic nor critical, but the byproducts are, for example, iron ore extraction projects leading to extraction of rare earths. We also thought that we need to really think carefully about the status of other or non-strategic projects, and this needs to be clarified as the increased prioritization of strategic raw materials project should not result in deprioritization of other projects in raw materials value chain. Third area we covered, very important one, and I think the other speakers will elaborate further, is secondary raw materials. I think we need measures to establish well-functioning markets for secondary raw materials because they can help reduce our reliance on certain critical raw materials and should therefore be considered under the scope of the CRM Act. I'm coming from the steel sector, so there are many examples, but let me say that efficient recycling of scrap can lower the raw material supply needs for metal manufacturing, and metal manufacturing will be key for many technologies which are bringing the green future. The scarcity of ferro scrap is anticipated to increase before 2030. Many of you know that basically the electrification in the steel sector is just starting and will continue until 2030, until we reach and find new technologies, breakthrough technologies which are not available right now and will probably be available later on. The fourth point is the...
Michael, conclusions maybe, with the others.
Okay, I will be short. The fourth point is the raw materials assessment and expansion of the list. We think that in addition to the materials listed as strategic and critical, there are also non-critical raw materials, but those could become critical in the mid to long term as the transition moves on. And last but not least, but I think we will elaborate on this, we need public support. The expansion of mining, processing and recycling industries will increase employment opportunities, but we need to ensure public acceptance for raw materials projects, which is very challenging. I was able to see the biggest new resource of iron ore in Kiruna, the new project in Sweden, and when I heard that this will take 15 to 20 years to start the production, the last thing I wanted to say, we need to significantly improve and make it easier to the permitting and licensing process. But we can speak more about these issues later on. Sorry to be so long.
Thank you, Michael, for being as brief as possible. I know that it's quite an exhaustive and extensive topic. I want to continue with you, Isabel. For instance, at the end of this input, we heard about public incentives and money as well, as opposed to the trade union movement has some ideas as well where public money should be spent, ensuring a just transition. So maybe you can give us a brief overview, managing the transition, answering to critical raw materials and shortages, how to deal with this from a trade union perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sophie, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today and to give the perspective of manufacturing, mining and energy workers, actually, because we are also representing a very wide range of workers who also see the importance of raw material, actually, to deliver on the green and the digital transition, but especially also on the energy transition, because whether we talk about the batteries, whether we talk about the wind turbines, or whether we talk about the photovoltaics or electrolysis, we are dependent on raw materials. So as Michael has seen, we really see a shift from a fuel intensive to a material intensive energy system. And so of course we welcome the initiative that has been taken by the EU Commission, but we are also very well aware of the impact, and we have to make sure that the negative impact are mitigated. First of all, what we see is this new situation, this dependency is leading to a new race for raw material in Europe, but also outside of Europe. So we have to secure the supply of raw material, but at the same time we cannot let it happen at any price. Actually, we have to make sure that it's fair and sustainable at the European level, because it is also a question of social acceptance, but also at the global level. And when we are talking about a sustainable way, we are talking about environmental, but also a social aspect. So how to mitigate the impact in Europe and ensure a sustainable approach at European level, as Sophie already hinted to. I mean, we are talking about a wide range of new activities: extraction, processing, refining, but also recycling. So we have to make sure that these activities are done in a fair way. I mean, we have to make sure that there is a just transition agenda that is also accompanying these new activities, ensuring workers' involvement, ensuring good working conditions, ensuring training and reskilling. I mean, the mining sector is also a very good example. For the moment, coal is currently the largest source of revenue for mining. I mean, we expect that this will change actually, because there will be new possibilities for mine. But again, these transformation imply that these take place in a socially responsible way, that workers also are given the possibility to transition from phasing out coal mining to new activities, so allowing the redeployment of coal workers. So this is also opportunities for some workers that actually might lose their job, but this has to be done in a fair way. Also, we have to look at health and safety impact. It's also clear that we also have to, but it has been mentioned already by Michael, that we have also to promote a more circular economy. And this is not happening. Everybody is saying that, but it really starts from the onset. The moment the products are actually designed, and it actually make the link to the Eco-Design Directive, for instance, the battery, we have already to integrate how we are going to dismantle these products. We also have to ensure the social pillar of sustainable raw material with binding standards, making sure that we have good working conditions that also goes together with these new activities. Again, this is a crucial element for social acceptance, but also to ensure the presence of workers in this sector. Social conditionality also is important. Michael has mentioned the importance of public funding. Well, public money cannot go without a social string attached. And let me just finish on mitigating the impact on the worldwide level. We also have a responsibility to make sure that we are not repeating the mistake of the past. We have to make sure that human rights and sustainability is also at the core of the European supply diversification strategy. So, and of course, what we want to avoid is some sort of neo-colonialism. So, of course, in terms of tool, we actually rely very much on the new upcoming legal instrument, the European Directive on Mandatory Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence, which will create some obligation to companies, both in terms of social and environmental aspects. And I will stop here.
Thank you for the first brief overview. I'm sure we can go into some aspects of this later on as well, of course, depending on your interest as well. For now, I want to hand over to Sandra. I think we moved a bit away from the focus on critical raw materials alone, and I would like to ask you to finish, because we've finished with this, or sorry, to continue with this, because you've been the rapporteur on the Green Deal Industrial Plan as well. So we've got a bit of broader view on the topic, and I would like to ask you to give us a short presentation.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you for everyone who's made it to this room now in the afternoon. I hope you're not into some kind of slump yet, and you will follow us a bit in our exchanges here. Indeed, I had the task, the pleasure to have a deeper look at the Commission's proposals in the context of the Green Deal Industrial Plan and the Net Zero Industry Act, of which the critical raw materials form, of course, a very integral part. What both have in common is they both really are in a very competitive environment right now. So there is a big competition going on in having access to the critical raw materials, and there's also a global competition going on with regards to attracting investment to industrial activity globally. And we here in Europe, of course, would like to get a big share of this investment activity. I think we need to be very clear that we want to keep Europe as an industrial base. And this is also something that we have been underlining in our statements in the EESC. However, it's very much a big task and a big ask at the moment. It's not a given that Europe is going to remain the industrial powerhouse, the economic powerhouse it has been over the past decades. We are very much facing stiff competition from the US, from China. Much of the investments that China is attracting today has come from Europe, is being taken away from Europe, because investment conditions here are really not very helpful for many of the companies. And that applies also to new technologies, to new activities, to new areas such as recycling or the circular economy, where we actually do want to have the global leaders here, where we want to have the global leaders for new technologies, for the production here in Europe. But it is a very, very tough battle that we are facing. The Net Zero Industry Act, the Green Deal Industrial Plan, they all have very interesting and good ideas. I mean, they are speaking a lot about the need for the access to critical raw materials, for strong supply chains and value chains that we here in Europe really can rely on. They are targeting the investment aspects, and they are also targeting innovation, a better governance. However, to be a bit provocative maybe, it's a lot of nice ideas and it's a lot of good proposals, but this is all it is presently, ideas and proposals. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US is more than just a plan. It's putting money on the table, it's attracting investments. Our plan is still a plan. We are still discussing it. We are still discussing parts of it, how it's going to be developed, when it's actually going to be available. Nobody knows. There is no funding yet available for people to actually go and use the framework that is proposed and really start investments, be it in critical raw material development, be it in mining, in refining, in producing here in Europe. None of this is actually readily accessible, while at the same time the US and China are moving ahead and are leaving us behind very much to our own detriment. So in addition to this being currently mostly a plan, it also sort of mentions a number of dilemmas which are not really being solved. One of which is one that we might be discussing here still today, between ensuring our social welfare and ensuring that our standard of living remains as high as it is today and possibly even improves, while at the same time having access to very critical raw materials, having a competition over them. So how do you improve our value chain without falling into the trap of more and more dependencies, without compromising our own labor standards, our environmental standards? How do we ensure that these are actually implemented in third countries, which not necessarily need us Europeans as customers? They do have alternatives. So how do we solve this dilemma? This is something that is mentioned in the Critical Raw Materials Act, in the Green Deal Industrial Plan, but answers are a bit scarce. So maybe today we can really look at this in more detail, also with you here and with my colleagues on the panel, and I stop there.
Thank you, Sandra. So this was the second input from the European Economic and Social Committee here from the panel. Last but not least, I would really like to introduce Diego again. He will bring in a bit of a different perspective today. While your title is Policy Officer for Raw Materials and Resource Justice, so I think we can really expect a different angle here, probably a bit more about the justice part, ours on a global perspective. So could you please give an input about your position when it comes to critical raw materials and of course what it means for industrial future of Europe?
Sure, thank you for that. So thank you everyone for coming today. So I will be given a little bit of a different view, of course, one that is a critical angle. And the reason why it is important to have these critical angles is because they enhance our level of positioning within this particular space. If we are in a circle, in a bubble, I would say, we tend to make solutions that sound all around the same everywhere. So I have 4 points to make today. One of them is that there's a lot of assumptions of how much materials we actually need. Let's look at the models at the moment. A lot of these models are based on market expectations to the future. They're also assuming a 2 to 3% economic growth across the world to 2050, right? And let's just put on the fact that economic growth, GDP growth, is tightly linked to energy use, which is tightly linked to raw materials in general across the economy. So right now we're making policies to 2050 with all of these assumptions that we think the world is going to behave a certain way, risking causing ecological collapse. We've already entrenched 6 planetary boundaries. I must say, 9 of them we have, and 6 of them have already been entrenched this year, we found out. So we're in a really critical situation. Another aspect of this is that these materials are somewhat needed for the energy transition, and this might be somewhat of a controversial take here. But let's be honest. 60 to 70% of nickel is actually needed for stainless steel. It's not needed for batteries, right? There's many other materials that are needed for the construction sector, the military sector. They're needed for ICTs. And then some of them, yes, of course, are needed for solar and wind, but not all of them. So it's important to really connect to what is exactly what we're mining for, to what technologies they're going to, and to what transition are we advocating for. Because a lot of the times we talk about an energy transition, it is an end-all, be-all. And then we talk about justice, we bring a just transition here or there as a paying lip service to it. But the energy transition that's being proposed at the moment is extremely unequal. Not only is it extremely unequal, it's relying on the concept of economic decoupling from environmental impacts, which, as data shows, is physically impossible at the moment. Or if it is possible, it would be so long from now that by that moment, the planet would have hit already 4 Celsius. So it's really important to bring it back to what kind of energy transition are we looking into. It is an industry-led energy transition. Doesn't have the word justice in it, but it's being paid led service. And who is actually going to be impacted by these? This brings me actually to the second point. The Global South impacts, as our colleague mentioned on the left, we do have, I come from the Global South, I come from Peru, and my country has a lot of options. It's not just Europe that wants these materials, it's also China, it's also Canada, it's also Australia, and some domestic materials is going to be necessary for our own consumption, right? Which is half of the consumption of the European Union. So in that sense, what I'm saying, per capita I mean, and in that sense is what I'm saying, that the EU needs to create a different economic development model that differs from China and differs from the United States. And this does require bringing African and Latin American and Asian states to the table and on equal terms, which just hasn't happened. And it needs to be a little bit of soul searching from the EU at this moment on how that is achieved. Because the Chinese are coming out with policies out there that are specifically talking about equal level playing field with the countries, but they're actually treating them, supposedly according to the documents of the Chinese government, as equals. And this is something that EU needs to take into account so that it doesn't lose the potential connections it can have with third countries to the Chinese state. Another third point that's really crucial is seldom talked about here is about who is going to be impacted by these mining policies. There is no green mining, let's just be honest about that. There is a lot of technologies we can use, 100%, but these cost money, and a lot of the companies are really concerned about the cost of dry tailings, for example, or using AI. These are costly as well, right? There are companies, of course, that are doing improvements. I'm not denying that, but it's not across the board. So let's just be honest, there is no green mining across the board. Another topic, what I was going to say, on the indigenous populations, 54% of the critical raw materials, or whatever you want to call them, strategic raw materials, are impacting indigenous lands and other land-connected peoples, particularly on the global south, and particularly in Sweden as well, in Finland and Norway. So the complete lack of discussion of indigenous populations within this policy is extremely concerning. The European Parliament did pass UN DRIP, or they did put it in their documents, with United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I must say every single country in the European Union has ratified. We're not talking about ILO 169, we're talking about UN DRIP. So basically, this document recognizes cultural rights of indigenous people. It recognizes also the free, prior, and informed consent to their land, right? And is a good tool to use to respect the rights of indigenous people. And it is really concerning that member states are completely opposed to this. Let's just remember that if we don't have people on board, there is no mining project. There is none. I mean, we are already looking at my country right now in the south of Peru, where the Antamina copper mine, owned by Chinese company, communities over there are mobilizing against this project. And this is completely stopping the project in its tracks. So to avoid this, if we want to actually have these mining projects, then the people need to be there first. So the lack of indigenous people is really concerning. And maybe that's just the last point, to kind of connect it back to the other point, is the issue of over-reliance on certifications. Certifications can be a tool, but they're not a proxy for due diligence, because there's a lot of issues with audits. We know that there's a lot of issues with audits. They're also used to pacify resistance, and they're also used to, in some ways, to lie to investors about the performance of a mining company. As we have known, Global Witness have done a report actually on the DRC on tantalum and tin, showing that there is serious human rights abuses within the supply chain as well. So we need to really be conscious of how much these certifications are used for the projects to get the green light without actual due diligence being acquired. And the reason why I say that is also really important for investors and for the mining companies, that if you don't take care of your own due diligence really, really well, then you can prepare for for unfortunately a local protest or what have you, a damage of image as well. So it is also important for mining companies to be aware that their due diligence matters in this, and not to rely just on certifications. And then that's for mining companies, and for the state not to put an over-reliance and cover your eyes just because a mining company has received IRMA 75 or what have you. There is still international instruments that these mining companies need to abide by. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to ask the technicians to give us the slide as well, that people may be able to put some questions and comments onto Slido. At the same time, I would like to start the discussion via microphone in the room. I think there is a microphone somewhere. A colleague? Sorry, just checking out the setup here. Who's got the microphone? Okay, over there, perfect. Because I've already seen one person who would like to speak, and assume that there are others as well who would like to give us some input, because I know these are controversial discussions, and believe me, being the European Economic and Social Committee, we have very controversial discussions as well, trying to come to a joint result at the end. So I've got 2, 3 over there. I would like to collect short comments and questions from the floor, and then we will answer them briefly in the end. So let's start with you in the 3rd row, I believe. Yeah.
I'm Dirk Finke from Aggregates Europe, UPG. I'm also part of the Essential Raw Materials Coalition, because what you, Mr. Pinter, said is actually very much true. We're talking about critical raw materials, strategic raw materials, but we forget about all the other raw materials. And when we ask, what about these one, they're not yet critical, but should we actually wait until they're critical? So we think the story is not complete with the Raw Materials Act. And just to remind you, for a wind turbine, we need several thousand tons of aggregates and concrete in order to make sure that a wind turbine does not tip over. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then maybe you can hand over the microphone 2 rows before. Exact, thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Dirk Bergrad, member of the ESC and representing IG Metall, the German Metal Workers Federation. And my question is, when we say that we compete on a global level on raw materials, what are the terms that we are competing on? Is it only the price, or is it also a question of the conditions around. And I would like to give one of the examples from my field of organization. One of the major German supplier in the automotive sector, I think a name well known, I'm not giving it today, has been heavily criticized for not engaging into the battery production. A couple of years ago, there were some issues. When one of the issues the company said was that if they would have to engage in the battery, they would have to engage in the whole of the value chain. And that implies also the question of mining. And given the realities of the mining business these days, this would not go hand in hand with the company's value, which has a very high standard, even in a German comparison. So if we want to say that we want to compete, isn't it that we have to take care not only about competing on the question of we pay more than others, but also to ensuring that the conditions are right? Thank you.
Thank you. Then I think there was one at the back.
Thank you. Jochen Hauf, BayWa RE, we're a renewable energy deployer, and I'm also part of Solar Power Europe. My question is a bit on the lack of action. You said these are talking points, others are acting, we are not. And at the same time, I understand that we're trying to do everything perfect, right? We want to do it in an anti-colonial way, we want to do it socially, taking this into account, the human rights, the environmental impact, all of which valid causes. Nothing is wrong here. But isn't it that complexity that we heap on top of the topic that keeps us from making the first step, or also the first little step? So my question to you is, each of one of you in a way, what can you give up? Which are maybe the 1 or 2 or 3 side conditions out of the 18 that we can relax at the beginning, yeah, so that we get going and then we still make it better, rather than discussing forever and ending up dead?
Okay, thank you. Then we've got another one here in row number 3.
Hi, Chris Heron from Eurometaux, Europe's Metals Association. Thanks for the interventions. Also ESC for the great work on critical raw materials so far. You mentioned a lot that we need to be in the developing countries to raise the standards, do things differently with the new model. And to do that, I guess our companies need to be there with operations to try and start that. Currently, we know that's not the case. It's China that is in a lot of these countries, as has been mentioned. It has a dominant position in the DRC, in Indonesia, growing in Latin America too. The companies in China are backed by the state. They have a massive financial advantage. So when we talk about the plans for Europe, what do we need to do to get our companies into the developing countries? And then what do our companies need to do when they're there to respond to the expectations of the local governments to do things differently? We hear that they do want a different model founded on sustainability, but they also need the companies to be there at the table and ready to do business. So what can we do to support the right kind of business from a European level? Thanks.
Are there still more questions? Yeah, over there, please. Sorry, in the first row, at the very left. Or
Sophia, but let's do answers because we won't remember so many questions.
Hi, my name's Tamir Chowdhury, so I work at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in Brussels, so we do policy advocacy out there. I would just be curious, it's one that I've been thinking about. What do we want to see with the next European election cycle?
Okay, well, I think the last one will be up to the European voters as well to answer, I'm afraid. It's nothing we can do here on the panel. However, we've had really a lot of great questions here from the room, and you can also see them on Slido. Let's try to answer all of them in a bit more than 10 minutes. So I'd say 3 minutes each from the panel. Try to be precise, and I will give you a sign when you're over the time. We have had some questions, and really I think, Michael, these are the ones that you should answer regarding the Critical Raw Materials Act, about the list, which critical raw materials are on the list. Do we need to evaluate the list? How should this be done? So we'd really appreciate some answers on this from your side, especially as the rapporteur.
Okay, I don't have ambition to address all the questions because I was not able to get all of them, but first of all, I truly believe that domestic mining in the EU is necessary for deployment of green technologies. There is absolutely no doubt about that, but as we all know, and I'm European as you are, we Europeans like to have what we want, but we never want it to be produced or mined in our neighborhood. And this is the thing what needs to be firstly changed. We need to really change the public perception. We need to ensure public acceptance for these projects because they are crucial and they are not guaranteed. Secondly, I think that it's absolutely necessary to translate these talks, legislative ambitions, promises, into something which is tangible, to simplify licensing and regulatory processes for the new projects, and simply said, to create business case for investment in Europe. This has been said by Sandra and me before. In United States, they were 2 steps behind us, and there are right now with IRA, after 1 year since it was implemented, they are 3 steps ahead of us. Just because the system in the US is incentives-based, subsidies-based. It's not a complex of very difficult long-term measures, complicated, overlapping. This needs to be changed for sure. Make the business case for the investments to come here in Europe. And one of the questions was touching upon the diversification. Of course, if we don't mine, if we don't recycle enough, then we have to bring the critical raw materials from somewhere. I was recently reading an article with the Australian Minister of Critical Raw Materials. You would probably not believe that they have a minister for raw materials. And she said, we are speaking to the EU, but so is the US and so is Japan. And when she was asked about what is the difference, she said and answered that the difference is that the EU is too slow. It's asking for everything, double pricing, the same prices for Europeans as for the Australians. This will never be the case. We are not living in the world of dreams. Let's face reality. And she also said that we are not fast enough to proceed. And as we discussed, when you look at the critical raw materials, and I was mentioning there is a Slido question, how many critical raw materials are in the EU? It's 34. And 17 strategic materials and 34 critical raw materials. As I mentioned already, in majority of them we are totally dependent. And you have to look on the production, but also on the refining and processing of the materials. And when you look at the production, it's final sentence, it's many countries. Australia, for example, lithium, 60% of the world, or more than 50% of the world production. But 96% of Australian lithium goes for processing into China. And China is controlling all the processing for majority of the critical and strategic raw materials. So we have to do something, otherwise the future won't be green and won't be digital.
I think one of the questions raised is also what can we do? Sandra, there have been quite a lot of questions about Europeans' position in the world regarding competitiveness, but also how to attract raw materials, for instance, from China for battery production. But there were also questions of the role of Europe's role regarding setting standards on a global level through trade agreements and so on. I know it's a lot to cover in 3 minutes, but I know you will do your best.
I'll try. Thank you for the questions and thank you for your input as well. Yeah, standards, I would say, is definitely one very good tool to try and assert some of Europe, not dominance necessarily, but at least presence in the global competition setting. So when we do have the possibility to actually set our own standards that we then manage to actually control, where our companies would have potentially a bit of a competitive edge, that would be very much what we should hope for. We do see it the other way around. We do see how Chinese projects that are very present in Ethiopia and other places, where they manage to put their standards forward, where Alibaba, I think, has started something that was called the Electronic World Trade Platform. And that has become a very important point and standard for others to follow. So we need to be much more active as Europeans, and we need to jointly work together and not have these 27 bubble discussions about competitiveness edges over each other within the EU, but we really need to be much more focused on the global scene and on understanding that this is where the race is taking place, not within Europe. We are not fighting each other, or we shouldn't. Unfortunately, we seem to do this quite a bit, but we should not be doing these fights here, but we should be looking at how to attract interest into what Europe has to offer in other countries. And I very much like the points that Diego made in terms of treating other countries as equal and being honest that some of the ideas that we might have won't work. There is, as you say, there is no green mining. There is certain boundaries that are physical boundaries, and that if we keep talking about how we wish them away, that's not going to help in any way. So we have to be more honest with people. We have to make clear that some of the solutions and some of the things that we need to implement might be a bit hurtful and might not help everyone, might actually go to their detriment, but it is necessary because we have a very, very big challenge ahead of us. So be a bit more open. The EU is not going to be self-sufficient no matter what we try. We can be innovative, and this is something that I've heard in a previous session this morning. There is a lot of interesting innovation happening where companies, where people are really trying to reduce our dependencies by finding alternative materials. And this is something that we can support from a political level as well, where there should be the right framework. But this is basically where we have our resources in innovation, in knowledge and people, and this is where we need to invest in.
Thank you very much. Quite to the point. The question of research and innovation, I think, is definitely one we can take with us. And maybe, Diego, you can follow up on this as well, addressing some of the concerns. There are so many boxes to tick and so much complexity in these issues. Can we do it? How to prioritize? So I think there have been some questions regarding this, and at what kind of cost does it come? Maybe you can follow up on those questions.
Yeah, so maybe I'll touch on that one. Maybe if I can touch on Chris's point, because that's also a really interesting question. So on that point, on the ticking of the extra requirements that are needed, I mean, I'm sorry, but like 10 years ago, there was very little oversight over the mining industry. I mean, the certification started around 15 years ago, but these environmental harms and social harms have been really caused heavily in the 1990s, particularly in the late 1990s and in the super commodity cycle. I mean, we're talking about serious human rights and ecological harms, right? So the fact that there is much more oversight of the mining industry, I mean, I'm sorry, but prepare for that. That is exactly what society expects you to do, to increase your environmental and social due diligence. And apart from that, environmental human rights due diligence, apart from that, us as civil society actually make your technology improve. The reason why I say that is because as criticism comes along, as protests come along, you have the duty then to see, how do I reassess my mining project? How do I improve it? Because I want to avoid these harms in the future. So in a sense, don't look at us as the enemy, or don't look at us like or the local communities are necessarily against you in some ways. Some might be, yes, of course, but in other ways you can work with them and erasing that. And there was a question: how do you increase social acceptance? Well, through transparency, through communication, through working with that community, and then also through following the international instruments and the local and regional laws, national laws. So that's one aspect. On the other aspect of Chris, I thought it was really important. So what can companies do? And so when we're talking about adding value creation in third countries, this is not really well defined within the Commission proposal, if anything at all. It includes maybe refining and also potentially even recycling. But recycling does create value added? Oh, absolutely. The refining process is still ecologically impactful, and we know that the mining process is the lowest value added, right? So how do they do that? Well, mining companies could, and some mining companies are already doing this, but they could work together with local companies to increase the research and development, because research and development is actually what creates one of the most value added things that an economy can have. Research and development, then also on the other end, services. Of course, the state can focus on that, but on the research and development, it's really good for mining companies to work with countries in the global south where they want to do business in, and with those governments. And it might actually be the case that in many governments might actually ask for local content. So you might have to be forced to do that anyway. So it's already good for companies already to work together in that sense. And then for the states, when we're talking about how do we increase input people on the at a table on an equal basis. But one of the things that the global north needs to do, I mean, we have extracted these materials for the last 500 years from the global south, countries like my own included, and the global south wants to reach the level of development and the level of consumption that the global north has. I mean, that's kind of our aspiration, right? And we're going to use this through fossil fuels because it's the most accessible to us. But how do we avoid that? Well, then Europe really needs to then allow or help the countries of the global south leapfrog that fossil fuel development. And how do they do that? Well, member states need to really focus on climate financing. I'm sorry, but we're not even paying enough. Focus on debt restructuring because a lot of our countries in the global south require these materials and we extract them really under terrible conditions because we have to pay external debt. So it requires a really holistic approach and not just focusing on the refining and the recycling as if that's going to solve everything. China is thinking about development on the ground of infrastructure. They're thinking about debt restructuring. They're talking about that as well. So if we don't come up with something equivalent or even better, then we are going to lose the ability to remain relevant. Because like I mentioned earlier, countries in the global south have choices. We're not in the world 30 years ago anymore. Thanks.
Thank you. Then last but not least, Isabel, I think there's a lot to follow up. Maybe you can also ask the question if there is a way to increase social and public acceptance regarding mining activities within Europe and well, ticking boxes on a voluntary basis, or are there more expectations for the new Commission?
Well, the question of public acceptance in Europe is key, actually, because we know, I mean, mining, for instance, is notorious for difficult working conditions. So, I mean, when I think it's Michael was saying when we need to improve to be fast, actually, to allow a permit and to exploit mines. Fine, actually, but not at any price, actually. We can do it together, actually. We can ensure the good working condition, we can ensure that health and safety is taken into consideration, we can ensure that the air is not polluted, and at the same time that we have actually new mines. I mean, there are examples in the north of Sweden. We hear that women working in administration actually leave their job to go and work into the mines because they pay better, actually. So I mean, it is possible to do it, but I mean, if you look at the last question here, where it said how can raw materials become more than the mere procurement issue in manufacturing, is just in time at the lowest price a model of the past. This is a problem. The business model actually is if cutting cost is the only approach, actually, then it is not sustainable. So this is why also we absolutely need to have a robust directive in Europe on due diligence, making sure that also there are mandatory rules for companies in terms of human rights and also environmental obligations. And it's not only the civil society and the trade union demanding such rules, it's also companies, because some companies actually are abiding already by the rule, actually, and they want a level playing field. So what is also playing in this discussion is the question of level playing field, and also of, we were talking, I think it's Dirk who was talking about competing at global level. Well, we can also compete on good working condition, on environmental standard. We can also bring into this notion of partnership, which at the end of the day is a win-win for everybody.
Thank you very much. We're sharp at 2:20, so no time for conclusions from my side, but I think you were an excellent audience. You had a lot of questions, and I think it was better that we were in a dialogue and that we could answer some of your points. I'm sure that all of the panelists are available afterwards for a few discussions as well. So thanks a lot to all of you, thanks to the podium, and good luck for the next part of the Industry Days. Thanks.
Thank you.